Welcome to today's seminar. My name is Anthony. I'm from Anthony Madrana from 𝗏𝗏 College and the National University of Singapore, the Department of History. I'm really excited to have you all here today. I'm excited to have those with us in person as well as those online for today's event entitled Thinking with the Andayas, Histories of Southeast Asia Motion, Histories of Southeast Asia in Motion. Excuse me. And before I begin, I just want to go through a couple quick housekeeping rules, and then I'll begin with some opening remarks. The first rule is if you're speaking, please speak into the mic. That's one important thing because the event is being recorded. And the second rule that we have is for those online, if you've got questions or comments or points you want to raise, please use your chat box. And the third little note that I want to raise before we begin is the NUS Libraries has a kind of a display of rare books and other books in the back that correspond with some of the material that's being shared today. Please, if you have time, take a look at the book collection in the back. So now back to the event. It's really with a lot of joy, I think, to do this today. What we are doing is we're thinking about Southeast Asian history. And if you've thought about Southeast Asian history, you've thought with the Andayas in numerous kinds of ways. Some of us have thought with the Andayas via distance, while as others have thought with them more intimately as teachers, as mentors, as advisors. We're going to hear today from some folks who have been able to think with them more intimately as teachers and as mentors and as advisors. Excuse me. I want to say that it's an important moment, and I want to welcome the Andayas as well, who are joining us via Zoom. Let's see, Barbara and Leonard, are you both there, or Barbara, are you there? Are the mics on? Not yet. Okay.
It's right now. Yes, I just unmuted them. I'm on his computer. Yeah, we're here. We're here.
Fabulous. I just want to say, welcome to this event. Thank you for making time to join us. And we really do hope that you have a swell time as you hear your former students share both some stories, but also their research and maybe the ways in which your relationships with them has in many ways shaped their scholarship. I'll say very quickly, for me, I was an MA student with the Andayas, and I think my turn to fish was very much indebted to them and their scholarship. Barbara had an interest in oceans. Leonard had an interest in oceans. I took a class, in fact, with Leonard called The Sea in Southeast Asian History. And these were sort of, I think, transformative for the way in which I think about the ocean, particularly through fish and people's relationships to fish. That's my little sharing, but I really want to dive into the folks that we have today. And before I do, I just want to acknowledge one very special attendee who is here in person, and that's Professor Wong-Gong Wu here in the front row. Welcome to the event, Professor. I will say, before passing the mic to, or welcoming rather, Professor Timothy Barnard to the stage, this is an event that we're doing today, certainly celebrating in many ways the work of the Andayas through the work of their students. And we have an event planned in September. The 28th of September, we'll have a full-day event at the Asian Civilizations Museum, and the Andayas will be there in person, along with some of their close colleagues, people like Professor Ray Leto, Professor Anthony Reed, and others. And so do join us if you can at the Asian Civilizations Museum on September 28th. That's something that NUS is organizing along with NTU, 𝗬𝗏, the Department of History, 𝗏𝗏 College. There's a whole bunch of people, the ACM, of course, a whole bunch of people involved in that event. And we're really excited to celebrate, again, both the work and the relationships that the Andayas have had over the years with students and colleagues and friends. Okay, now to the event at hand, and I want to turn to our first speaker, who is Professor Timothy Barnard. He is a professor in the Department of History here at NUS, and he is a professor of the Malay world and of Southeast Asian history, cultural, ecological history, environmental history, Malay film, and so many other wonderful things, animals in particular these days, and plants most particularly these days. Welcome to the stage, Professor Barnard.
Thank you, Anthony, and greetings to the Andayas and Prof. Wong and others who have come here today. And while we slowly get the, of course, needed PowerPoint slides up there, I'll wait for a second. And what I would like to say, when Anthony first came to me and said he would like for me to share at this session, I already, in a sense, had a paper I've been working on for almost 20 years, or you could almost say for my entire career. And so what I want to talk about today is Filipinos. Essentially, it started out as Filipinos in Malay Malacca and the presence of Eastern Southeast Asians, if you will, in Malacca. And I'll explain how I got to the point of this as a topic, but I have to begin with Honolulu in 1992. I arrived in August along with Bill Cummings and Grace Mateo, very excited to study under Barbara and Leonard Andaya. We go to Sakamaki Hall, we register, we're very excited to be graduate students under their supervision. But there was a problem. They weren't there. And they weren't even employed by the University of Hawaii. And we thought we had made a horrific mistake. The three of us would kind of gather together and say, okay, what do we do now? And people at the university kept saying, oh no, we promise they're coming. They'll arrive. Leonard eventually showed up in January of '93, and due to immigration issues and other issues of wrapping up their lives in New Zealand, Barbara arrived in January 1994. And that first semester, we all took a class under Robert Van Niel. And I wrote a paper. Through various circumstances, Leonard read the paper, liked it very much. And he said, can I send it to Barbara, who was still in New Zealand? And she read it and gave me copious notes of feedback. And then I submitted it, and it essentially became my first publication. I had a bit of a long road. But I wrote a paper on Riau in the 19th century and the island of 𝗶𝗨𝗏 and writing there. And this is what I was going to do my dissertation on. I was going to do my dissertation on literature in 19th century Riau. And I thought this was perfect. Barbara had worked on the 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 and the annotation of that. Leonard had written a book called Kingdom of Johor. And it was just kind of a continuation of that. And I was told, and I don't know if it was Leonard or Barbara, but one of them told me, please, you do not come here to study under us and do this political science modern stuff. No, you have to do the early modern period. Okay. So Grace, Bill, and I each had to work on an early modern topic. There was no choice. I see many of their graduate students today who've done 20th century topics, and I'm like, what happened? It's insane. But eventually, I wrote my dissertation on a state in Eastern Sumatra called 𝗵𝗹𝗃. Finished my dissertation in '98. Bill finished his on Makassar in '99. And Grace, who had to return to the Philippines to take care of family and had obligations at UP Manila, finished hers on Ilocos in 2004. And so the first three PhD students who studied under the Andayas all did early modern topics on island Southeast Asian societies, as we were told to. Now, this all worked out well because we were entering a world in the 1990s where early modern Southeast Asia was very important. Now, sure, there were people doing very good social, political work on 19th and 20th century. There was even the Eden Project working on ecology and environment through the 𝗏𝗏𝗏 and Peter Baumgart in the 90s. But a lot of the major important Southeast Asian historians at the time were working on the early modern era, the era between 1500 and 1800. Among those was Tony Reed and Vic Lieberman. They had their 2-volume works. The one time that kind of came together was the edited book that's kind of at the top there, the Southeast Asia and the early modern era, which we all had to own and we read through, and it was very important work. And Tony Reed's Southeast Asia and the Age of Commerce, when it first came out in 1988, it was like a nuclear bomb going off. You hadn't read a book like that before. And then Vic Lieberman comes along with his, well, island Southeast Asia, I don't know about that, take on the era. And the point is, there was a lot of talk and discussion and intellectual fervor focused on the early modern era at the time. And Bill, Grace, and myself were thrown into that. And Barbara and Leonard, being among the leading scholars of that, were getting us in that and getting us in the debates and having us discuss these things. That's the context of what we were working on. Now, to bring us to the actual topic of what I want to discuss today, in 2002, or it could have been 2003, I'm a little shaky on this one, Grace invited me to go to a conference in Davao. And myself and John Mixick went to Davao City. And it was for 𝗵𝗶𝗃𝗏, which is one of these wonderful acronyms they have throughout the region. I believe it's something like Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Eastern Asia Growth Area or something. I don't know what it stands for, but it's one of these conglomerations of ASEAN friendship and fellowship. And we were invited to a 𝗵𝗶𝗃𝗏 conference in Davao City run by UP Manila. And so Grace brings us in, and I remember sitting on the roof of a parking lot, eating balut and drinking beer and talking with Grace. And we kept joking about Malays in the Philippines or Philippines in the Straits of Malacca. And Grace and I said, well, we should work on a paper for that. And so Grace and I began to work on a paper for that. And so that's one of the reasons this presentation is really by me and Grace Mateo. Okay. Now, Grace passed away tragically in 2010, but the idea is there. Okay. Oh, skipped one there. So let's turn to the actual topic, the world of early modern island Southeast Asia, which is what we were thrown into. And if one of the things, even if you're not familiar with the era or the region, one of the more famous tales globally is of Magellan's journey around the globe, which he actually didn't complete, but 𝗶𝗏𝗏, who maintained the diaries of it. When they arrived in the Philippines, the translator, the slave, whatever, the companion of Magellan, was able to speak in Malay with people in the Philippines, okay? And what they began to realize was they were entering a huge trade zone in which there were a number of common cultural characteristics, in which Malay language was the lingua franca, in which there were common trade activities, and in which throughout island Southeast Asia, despite its diversity, despite its just rich cultures, there was a certain commonality that allowed people to interact and discuss. Now, we have to remember when the Europeans were arriving, they were here really for trade items. They were here for the spices, nutmegs, clove, and mace, which Leonard goes into in his own book, World of Maluku. And they were here for a particular reason. And whether it was those spices in Maluku or control over Malacca as a trade node, their focus was entirely on moving these trade products and what they could know or understand about the region. So when we actually look at the documents that were spurred into our mind with Grace and I over dinner in Davao, we started to think about Easterners in the West and Westerners in the East. And if you look at the Summa Oriental by 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏, he writes that people from Luzon are little thought of in Malacca. We don't really, they might be around, but we don't really consider them very much. But he also goes on to write that they're almost the same people as the Malays of Borneo, and there is no division among them. So similar cultural practices and beliefs. And this also points to the idea of the use of sources and the Western sources. And this is one of the things the Andayas infused into all of us who studied with them, is this idea that, yes, I was sent to the Dutch archives. Okay, Bill spent many a day in Makassar reading through, chronicles and what have you. Grace in Spain and the Philippines. You read these Western sources, but as Barbara even raised in her essay about Reed's 2-volume Age of Commerce, it's about an overdependence on Western sources. What differentiates us as Southeast Asian historians is an appreciation of local sources, of local cultural milieus and understandings of it. And so I turned to, okay, Grace, let me find out about traditional Malay texts. Well, if you look at the Sejarah Melayu, of course, places like Makassar are mentioned several times. Maluku is mentioned once. Philippines, no, not so much. Not at all. The Hikayat Hang Tuah, no mentions of the Philippines, at least. But the thing is, we also have to realize why these texts were written. They were written they were recorded at least several hundred years after the fall of Malacca. They were recorded as texts to reinforce ideas of loyalty to the Sultan and proper behavior. And it wasn't necessarily documenting great trade connections and links. So Grace and I began then to look at other sources, and you look at things such as the Boxer Codex. Now, the Boxer Codex it came from Spain or the Philippines, and it's a Spanish text that basically documents who's involved in trade and who participates in things like that between particularly Philippines and China. And they have these very beautiful paintings of various stereotypes, if you will, of the ethnic groups involved in the trade. And among those are, and this is from the Philippines, are a Malay couple from Terengganu, a Brunei warrior and his wife, and a Javanese warrior. And so these were people you could see in Manila, or you could see in China trade ports and such. And so it gives us an idea of the stretch and the reach of Westerners in the sense of people from the Western archipelago in the eastern part of the archipelago in Southeast Asia. Now, the thing is, we can also look at various official places or policies and positions. For example, in Malacca, you always famously had the Shahbandars. Shahbandars are the officials who oversaw trade. If you came from a particular area such as India and you arrive in Malacca, there would be one official who dealt with you. He would sit there and explain the rules. Okay, you got to do this, you got to do that. I'll take care of you. We got, a place for you to stay over here. He basically oversaw trade from particular areas. There were 4. One was focused on Java, Molucca, Banda, Palembang, and Luzon. So in other words, the Eastern Archipelago. So in other words, there was a Shahbandar specifically for trade from the East in Malacca and to deal with the merchants coming in from the East. Also, another important official in Malacca was the Temenggung, who is usually described as the chief magistrate. And during the early Portuguese era, someone from Luzon, a Filipino, was appointed as the Temenggung under the Portuguese because all the Malays had fled to the Johor Riau area. And so most of this shows of the importance of not only trade with the East, but the presence of merchants moving in and out of Malacca from the East. Eastern Indonesia, Luzon, Malacca trade, and it all usually moved via Java and Makassar and other merchants that other people, many other scholars have brought up, and even some of the people who will speak today and be involved in this, such as Lance. and so the idea is also we have another source, a text, much like the Boxer Codex. It's the Portuguese version of it, if you will. And This is another painting of Malay Gentiles from Malacca, from that codex that you can, late century, 16th century, and you can get an idea of what's going on. Now, I don't have too much time to deal with all of this, but I want to bring it back around to discuss, what does this all tell us? Well, people from Luzon may have been little thought of in Malacca, but they were present, as were all types of people from the Eastern archipelago, eastern portions of the archipelago, because they were all integrated into a larger cultural milieu during the early modern period. And this is something that not only we see in the sources in our little escapade between me and Grace, but also in the works that the Andayas produced after we arrived in Hawaii. So when we arrived in 92, these were the Andayas who had written Kingdom of Johor, 𝗏𝗏𝗃𝗏𝗏, Heritage of Ārung-Palaka, and done the annotated Tufat. All fine works. Well, people often forget about those because they went on to work on various other texts when we were in Hawaii. So 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏's Brothers and World of Maluku came out soon after they arrived. And then, of course, you have Leaves of the Same Tree, The Flaming Womb, and you even have things like the Cambridge History of Early Modern Southeast Asia and other issues. And plus today, of course, they're still working on herding cats and creating the modern Cambridge History of Southeast Asia, with seemingly 400 different authors involved. But the core of all of this, and the core of what they taught me and Bill and Grace, was to respect our sources. So whether I went on, I didn't necessarily abandon early modern Southeast Asia. I continue to write something occasionally, but I went on to work on the things Anthony listed, film in 20th century Singapore and Malaysia, plants and animals in Singapore, and Komodo dragons and such. But it all came down to respecting the sources and respecting the interpretation and perspectives of Southeast Asians in this process. And so whether I go to take boats up the Siak River, or sit at home and watch endless reels of Malay film, or travel, walk around Komodo Island with a ranger and a stick to keep lizards at bay, it's all about understanding the environment and the landscape and the sources and the perspectives. And this is something they instilled, I believe, in all their students, but they particularly did it when they came in with so much energy in the 1990s when I first arrived. And if anything, the continual branching out into other aspects of Southeast Asian history is a legacy. It may have begun in early modern Southeast Asia and my forced study of it, but their appreciation of these sources and interpretations branched out into these other areas that I have personally gone into. And so I'll leave it at that. And if you have questions, save them for later.
Beautiful, beautiful there, Tim. That was great. And absolutely, I want to echo the importance of sources and local worlds. That's certainly, I think, something that we all cherish and have gained from the Andayas. Our next speaker is Professor Bryce Beamer from Duke Kunshin University. Bryce, over to you.
Okay.
Oops, that was my timer.
Okay, great. So I'm going to speak about the Andayas after I've done my presentation. So I'm going to present my research in fragments because that is what it is right now. It's a subject that I spend time on when I really should be finishing up my book manuscript. And so there won't be much connective tissue between these fragments. That work isn't done yet. And I'm going to start with 3 mini fragments that, while they're going to be confusing at first, will create a kind of through line for my paper. The first is something like a campfire story that nearly every Burmese kid will hear and remember. A man is traveling to an ancient city, Pagan usually, but it could be Minbu or Sagaing or any area where ancient Buddhist temples have been under continuous use for 100 years or for more than 100 years. He meets a beautiful woman. learned, charming, a catch, but surprisingly old to be without a suitor. And this goes to the back of his mind, but he pursues her. They're married. They produce a beautiful, talented daughter, the image of the mother. But something is strange. Every year since they were married, she takes a vacation home to see her family, a family the husband has never met, and he's never invited to come along. And now she's taking the daughter. So like an old lover. I mean, who knows what's going on? So eventually he must know. He shadows them on their trip to the ancient city and is terrified to see his wife and daughter put on the clothes of beggars, sweep and clean an ancient temple, and plead for money from lay worshippers. His wife is an accursed pagoda slave from a family bound by an ancient curse to support the temple. The sentence is for eternity. To break it is to suffer an agonizing skin-rotting disease. The daughter has inherited the mother's curse. So this is a horror story. So it ends with any kind of varied awfulness. The man's hair turns white. He has a heart attack and dies on the spot. He commits suicide. He goes home and burns down the house, changes his name, and moves far away. So slide 2 is this. Great. So the second fragment dates to 1892, and it is from an archaeological survey of a temple complex in Pegu by the inimitable Sino-Burmese intellectual 𝗏 and he reports, I'm going to kind of let you guys read these after this. I have several quotes, but most of the stone inscriptions have been broken by treasure hunters or by pagoda slaves who were anxious to obliterate the record of their origin. In some cases, the names of persons dedicated as pagoda slaves have been carefully chiseled out. So this is not the only evidence from the colonial era of these agentive curse-breaking actions taken by pagoda slaves against the lithic inscriptions, binding them, they believe, to perpetual enslavement. The third fragment, the 2017 movie June, a word which means slave in Burmese, a putatively serious and sensitive portrayal of the continuing prejudice that plagues modern-day descendants of pagoda slavery. It is the story of a callow playboy, the scion of a rich, terrible family who manages a family-owned 5-star resort in Pagan. So like the campfire story, he falls for a girl who, unbeknownst to her, was adopted from a pagoda slave family. When this is revealed, all manner of tragedy develops. So the filmmakers and actors believe that they were making a statement against prejudice, but inexplicably portrayed real villages in Pagan, known to be populated by the descendants of pagoda slaves in real life, as filthy, backwards, and populated by sufferers of Hansen's disease or leprosy. Implicitly, these disfigured people are cursed ex-slaves who defied the generational obligation to whatever Pagan temple they were pledged to. And protests erupted in Pagan from real descendants who cried foul, accusing the film of fanning prejudice and calling for a ban. Okay. So the end of my mini fragments and on to my first big fragment, the Pagan era. If my audience knows much about the history of Burmese pagoda slavery, it is certainly from Michael Ongthwin's classic History of Pagan. Burma studies scholars will certainly have read Van Toon's equally impressive research. Pagoda slavery is critical to our understanding of Burma's classical era. Pagan was a temple building and largely agrarian society. Slaves were gifted to temples by the elite and tasked with their maintenance to support the perpetuation of the Dharma and to care for the Sangha, and to farm, herd, cook, and manufacture all daily necessities of a temple complex. The number of these slaves were vast. Gifting slaves to temples was one of the most pronounced elite practices in the Pagan era. Their bodies, I think we can think of them as the coin used to buy salvation. The gifting of the enslaved people forms a significant portion of many surviving lithic inscriptions, so much so that Van Toon points out, we know more about Pagan era slaves than any other segment of the society. Their names, ages, gender, ethnic background, family sizes, their skills, and their assigned labors. So temples were to be cared for in perpetuity. and great care was made by elite donors to ensure that pagoda slavery was an inherited status passed down from parents to children. Curses were a common feature of temple inscriptions, which promised gruesome supernatural consequences for fleeing slaves or for those who might lay claim to them. Finally, as both Thon Thun and Ong Thwin make clear, pagoda slaves do not appear to have been alienated from Pagan society. Within pagoda slavery, there were likely position-bearing status within the society, and evidence for this seems to be attested to by the elite act of donating their own children to a temple. So pagoda slavery, or at least many positions within pagoda slavery, seem to have been viewed as a noble pursuit. Fragment 2, the post-Pagan era, especially the reign of King Th-Loon. So the reign of King Th-Loon is well known to scholars for his energetic and successful efforts to refashion the Burmese state politically, economically, bureaucratically, and religiously. And pagoda slavery was deeply impacted in this era. Oh, and I should say King Th-Loon's reign is very important to the work of Victor Lieberman, which I think many people are familiar with. So we see in surviving royal orders moves to segregate pagoda slaves from others and to further close any avenues out of this kind of slavery. Marriage laws were changed. Non-slaves that deigned to marry pagoda slaves automatically reduced to that status. More critically, we see it become a demeaning or dishonored form of labor. So we see it arise as a punishment now for serious crimes, a humiliation that's doled out to failed coup plotters, and a job for war slaves. Thon Thun and others suspect that the outcast or untouchable status of pagoda slaves took root in this era. Fragment 3, the gradually encroaching British colonial era. So James Scott, who penned The Burman, His Life and Notions, frequented Upper Burma between 1875 and 1882 when it was still an autonomous kingdom. His book published in 1882 recounts the continued ubiquity of pagoda slavery. I'm just going to let you read that. So Burmese society contained, perhaps surprising to some, caste-like social positions of polluted people and polluting labor. And by the end of the Compound era, but likely long before, we see pagoda slaves occupying the same socially degraded space as criminals who are punished with face tattoos, so their crime was actually written on their faces, funeral preparers, and handlers of the dead. British encroachment was gradual, claiming Arakan and Tenasserim in 1825, Rangoon and the rest of Lower Burma in 1858, and finally overthrowing the monarchy in 1885. In some places, pagoda slaves seized advantage of this political turmoil, breaking temple inscriptions or just fleeing their enslavement. This explains the 𝗏𝗏𝗀𝗀 quote that I had showed you earlier from 1892, reports of shattered and excised inscriptions in Pagoo. Another case emerges from colonial reports of Burma's earth oil fields north of Yanangyaung in Burma's dry zone, which captivated colonial observers because of the unique way oil was siphoned from the earth by hand. Interviews with oil collectors revealed the following, and I'll let you read that yourself. British law formally outlawed all forms of slavery in Burma, or at least slavery that fit the British definition of slavery, which pagoda slavery certainly did. Experience in India meant that curious observers of the practice read it as caste-like, which, because of their background in India, they saw as a sign of backwardsness and superstition. Colonial reports make mention of situations when protests would break out, when a former pagoda slave found appointment within the colonial service, and on principle, the British refused to relinquish these appointments. Juridical steps would be taken, such as this 1922 pronouncement from the Akyab district government that you can read here. Yet, pagoda slavery continued because the prejudice was pernicious. Escape required moving, adopting a new identity, and hiding. I need to do much more research, but in Rangoon for a time, the 𝗏𝗏𝗀𝗀𝗏s freed pagoda slaves who moved out from their slave quarters, were shunned and forced to take refuge back in the pagoda, eventually becoming the merchants who were selling religious offerings on the stairway up to the platform. Another colonial document reports that, enterprising no-goodniks from Mandalay used to search out hidden pagoda slaves with scavenged lists of temple donations. And it is reported that wealthy merchants in Pegu were frequently victims of extortion. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't show this earlier. So this is the Rangoon Gazette, and it's saying right here, for nearly 200 years have elapsed since the {𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏} were condemned to this punishment, and the British government now is freeing the slaves from their social burden. Okay, here we go. Fragment 4 from 1948. Amazingly, or maybe not if you've been following my talk, the Union of Burma's first president, 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏, wove the plight of pagoda slaves into his inaugural address to the National Congress, and then officially freed them as one of his first acts as president. Fragment 5, idealism and the parliamentary period. For reasons entirely unclear to me, in the middle 1950s, the Burmese state became invested in the liberation of pagoda slaves. And these acts appear to illuminate political commitments to Fabian socialist ideals, equality, anti-feudalism, and rational government policy that sprung up alongside the instability that we usually use to describe the first 2 decades of democracy in the independence period. So through 1955, newspapers announced the opening of schools and libraries in pagoda slave communities. The state took steps to track literacy rates and guarantee that they would rise. The state created employment opportunities for pagoda slaves. Yet, the most intriguing and loudly trumpeted of these actions at that time was something that we could translate as a beggar's banquet. Which were called 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 and others from these untouchable categories. The �𝗟𝗏𝗧 literally means mixing hands together. And this strikes me as a politically savvy name for this policy, as the government was hoping to dispel longstanding notions that social interaction, the touching of temple slaves, passed bad luck and illness onto their social betters. Okay. Big fragment 6. The first decades of independence also sees the rise of a pagoda slave as figures of lasting inequality and injustice in fiction, especially in the kind of literature that we would call in the West like social or socialist realism, which was a potent genre of fiction in the democratic period and the early, more idealistic parts of the post-1962 Ne Win era. One example I've read is Khin Min Yu's short story Endless Hoping. It is a story of unrequited love between a pagoda slave boy pulling at the yoke of oppression and a city girl visiting relatives in Pagan. Machinations create an explosion of conflict, but the story culminates with the radio announcement of President 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏's 1948 proclamation to end pagoda slavery. The boy changes his name and disappears to the big city, probably Mandalay, and the narrator wishes him well on his new life of freedom. So the suffering of pagoda slaves was a subject of many authors, and 2 more movies from this era that I know of, I'm fairly sure, but I've had difficulty locating copies. So at this point in my talk, would you be surprised to learn that pagoda slaves still exist in Burma? My final fragment, pagoda slaves are classic subalterns, written about, summoned and described to appease different elite agendas, the voiceless subjects of state programs, even when the goals are generally munificent. The movie June, right, Slave, was released in 2017, well-meaning, but ultimately patronizing, ignorant, humiliating. A serious film about injustice that made no move to consult the community it was putatively speaking for. So is there an academic word for the transition from when a subaltern community lays claim to its voice? Do they transition from being subalterns to dom-alterns? Whatever the case, when it is politically possible to travel to Pagan, this is my next research agenda, to learn how Pagan's descendant communities came together to protest this film and to defend and lay claim to their own heritage. So that's the end of my talk. So I'm going to slightly break with tradition, because to say what I intellectually owe the Andayas is to point out that I owe them everything. They won me over to history when I was an MA student that wanted to be an NGO worker. They took me into the Hawaii PhD program when I dropped out of another grad school after 2 years of anxiety and frustration. The Fulbright, the Mellon, the SSRC grants, my career with Duke in China, a job that gives me daily joy. All of it flowed from their being inspiring and nurturing. They are role models of, I practiced this earlier and cried, so I'm not sure what happens now when I do it for real, but they are role models of scholarship, collegiality, and kindness. And there is no part of my academic life that is not in some way inspired by Barbara and Leonard, and I wish them the greatest and happiness of all possible retirements in this world. Thanks.
Thanks so much for that, Bryce. I think I've got some tears in my eyes now. Let's see. So our next speaker, our next speaker is Miss Celeste Bay from Yale-US College and the real world as well. Over to you, Celeste.
Thank you. I hope I'm audible for everyone, but I'm very humbled to be here amongst, some really great scholars. I'm here just speaking a little bit about my topic for today, which will be King 𝗏𝗏𝗏 in Johor. This really was my capstone piece in Yale-US College. I majored in history, and I think for me, right, my connection to the Andayas, to the professors there, is when they visited Singapore. This was pre-COVID. I think it was 2018. Feels like a lifetime ago, but when I really think about the impression they made, right, it really is similar to everyone else, right? Like respecting the sources, really looking for that diversity and being diligent about it. Not just thinking, oh, okay, there's this book written back in, I don't know, 1900s, 1800s. I will just take it and run with it, right? It's that diligence that they imparted. And I think specifically, after hearing a few of the talks, it's also just how they have inspired generations of scholars, right? When they were here in 2018, they were doing the exact same thing they were doing in 1992, 1993. So that, to me, is just inspirational, right? It's a lifetime of work, but it's also a lifetime of diligence. And I think that's something I really wanted to talk about. So for me today, I'm gonna just pull up another photo. So they were in Yale-US, they were in Singapore, but I also had the opportunity to go to Hawaii in 2019 as an exchange student. I was in UH Manoa, and this is a photo of us. We had a chat, we talked about my capstone piece, what I was thinking about doing, lots of good, I think, feedback as well as advice, right, that I was able to receive. But this is something that, I cherished very deeply. I think my time there, even though it was just a few months, allowed me access to the archives, right, in Hawaii. It allowed me access to so much more research that was done that, you might not be able to get, catch wind of in Singapore, right? You just don't know that maybe it exists. So again, that diversity of sources, that diversity of knowledge. And that is a little bit about that connection. But I think just for my topic, right, King 𝗏𝗏𝗏 in Johor, I think before I dive into it, it would be good for me to talk a little bit about Hawaii's history a little bit, right? The context of it all, because I think it does also contextualize how 𝗏𝗏𝗏 got to Johor, why he did so, why he found it impactful. Just a very quick timeline here, but in 1810, right, we see Kamehameha unifying the Hawaiian Islands, and this is a really pivotal moment for Hawaii, right? And in 1848, that's when we move into the point of the Great Mahele, which really, in a nutshell, ended the previous system of land tenure in the Hawaiian Kingdom, which was a bit more feudal in nature. It introduced the idea of private ownership of property. People could apply for lands. They could say that this is a piece of land that I now own. And between 1848 all the way up until the end of the timeline here, or even further beyond, I think it's also important to point out that Hawaii, the Hawaiian Kingdom, signed several treaties with international polities to assert friendship, to allow the free movement of ships, right, passage. And that was also something that maybe isn't really talked about a lot because of where Hawaii stands now, right, in the current context. But this is important, right? The fact that they're signing treaties with France, with Tahiti, with Japan, this really allows other polities to recognize the Hawaiian Kingdom's independence and sovereignty, but also is clear evidence that Hawaii was participating in the international diplomatic landscape of the time. They weren't just, within their island chain, hanging about, just being very inward, right? They were going out, they were sending people out, they were sending envoys out, and that is the clear evidence of that. Next on is in 1875, the Reciprocity Treaty was signed by 𝗏𝗏𝗏 with the United States. What that is, I think just very simply a duty-free market for Hawaiian sugar to enter a sugar-hungry United States tax-free, right? Duty-free. And this also changed things because it allowed the infrastructure of Hawaii to change towards that sugar plantation landscape. It flourished, of course, infrastructure in terms of transport, in terms of immigration, and it flourished and was dependent on the sugar industry. And Hawaii very quickly became reliant, to a certain extent, economically on the benefits of this reciprocity, which then warranted 𝗏𝗏𝗏 to actually sign the extension in 1884. Right, he had to ratify the extension, which then was the point in which the US said, okay, we actually want a little bit more now. We want pu'uloa. We want what we know now as Pearl Harbor. They wanted to build, start building Pearl Harbor. And in Native Hawaiian history, right, that is a really, like, mythologically speaking, a lot of mythology is based out of pu'uloa. And at the same time, it's an abundance of resources that are there. People have relied on the resources there for centuries, and that changed very quickly with 1875, with 1884. So that is a key moment as well, because in 1881, when 𝗏𝗏𝗏 embarks on his world tour, there's all these pressures that he has back at home. There's this baggage that he has as he goes on to the rest of the world. For his world tour, he first went incognito. He wasn't making an official tour, but very quickly, it became an official tour. And that's how we know of it today, but also knowing that he was that first monarch to circumnavigate the globe in 1881. And this is just a very quick map of where he did land when he was on his world tour. Just some little pinpoints that shows exactly how he traveled, right? Many different parts. But I want to focus today on Asia specifically. The fact that he did go to Asia, and he also spent a lot of time there for a specific reason, for a specific purpose. There are a few theories on why he embarked on the journey. the first theory, I think it's the most popular one. It's really to meet the demand for labor, in the sugar plantations, and we know from our sources that at the end of the day, right, it's Japanese labor that really came into Hawaii to meet that demand. But at that point, he was searching for that demand. Who could we partner with to bring in that labor that we sorely need for, the sugar industry? And another theory is to really garner support against a rapidly dominating United States in Hawaii. He, I think, knew that if he had intended for any support at all, he needed to be the first mover in forming those alliances. He needed to go out into the world and start forming alliances so that they could, stand up against any future unfair treaties that he had to sign. So he did attempt that when he was in Qing China as well as in Japan. In Qing China, he actually spoke about cooperation between Asian states. He famously did say about how the Europeans have also been nibbling away at Asia and how if we unite, we will be strong. So he did say that already. He has been talking a little bit about coming together and uniting with each other as, Asiatic nations. In Japan, he did it a bit more directly, he was a bit more forthcoming. He suggested a marriage between his niece, Kaiulani, as well as the Japanese prince, Komatsu. And my assertion is that, with Japan, he was a lot more forthcoming because he maybe had an impression that Japanese labor could then be more accessible if this marriage were to occur. He also asked for the Japanese emperor to join him in sponsoring a federation of Asiatic nations and sovereigns. So as he travels, into Asia, he really is garnering that support. He's asking directly, shall we unite together? Shall we band together as an Asiatic nation, as an Asian nation, right? And that is really interesting because we don't think that, like 𝗏𝗏𝗏 was doing this. It's not really well spoken about, but I also want to talk a little bit about when he was in Singapore, because after he was in Qing China, after he was in Japan, he moved into Singapore. And what you'll see here on the screen is actually just some of the things that happened when he was in Singapore, from when he arrived all the way until he left. It's interesting to note, or I think it's a bit funny to note, that when he was in Singapore, he apparently wanted to buy some pearls for his wife, but found the prices exorbitant. So very relatable. 1881 Singapore, same as now. But I think what's also fascinating to me, or at that time, was that all these things that were planned out in terms of his itinerary. He has various engagements planned that are really familiar facets of international diplomacy. The protocol seems similar, right? When he arrived at Johnston's Pier, where currently the Fullerton Bay Hotel is, how there are officials to welcome him, formal visits. It's important to note that there was a Hawaiian consul that mediated the visit and the interaction with other consuls representing different states. So all of this to say, again, right, that 𝗏𝗏𝗏 has, or Hawaii has, this sophisticated participation in international relations, in diplomacy. And right at the bottom here, you'll see that there was an official banquet that was held at the government house, the present-day Istana, that were attended by many high-ranking individuals, and among them was the Maharaja of Johor, Abu Bakar. So this is probably when Abu Bakar's inviting him to make a trip to Johor for a day, for a night. Come by, let's have a chat, let's play billiards together. And this unplanned visit actually was going to be very important because it's going to be a very special visit for 𝗏𝗏𝗏. The words might be quite small, but essentially what I will say is that in Johor, there were a few important things that happened. First and foremost was a ceremonial exchange. And when when 𝗏𝗃𝗧 arrived in Johor, almost immediately, one of his companions, Armstrong, did note that there was a sword bearer who carried an enormous sword, right? And there was an immense red umbrella of state, right? So Malay regalia that was already being presented at that point when 𝗏𝗃𝗧 arrived. And the Hawaiian king actually responded very similarly because he pulled out the ahu'ula, which is the golden feathered cloak that he had brought. This is unusual for this tour because we don't really see it being pulled out anywhere else. So we almost see that he's maybe responding, right, in a way that he's trying to make an impression. He's trying to make an impression in response. And it's interesting that both of the sovereigns did access more indigenous methods of performing their status as leaders during this exchange. And although they may be a bit different in the meaning, I think what we can expect is that there was this air of solemnity that existed during this point. Something they also did when they were together was a couple of cultural comparisons. One big one is that they were looking at each other's facial features and physical features, and they were like, oh, we look really the same. And 𝗏𝗃𝗧 even said that if he spoke our language, I would have imagined that he was a relative of mine, of our prince, that he basically was, we were of the same, kind, and that kinship had been formed. But what's more important is that they compared words. In Malay and Olelo Hawaii, they looked at words like fire, right? Api versus ahi. They looked at words like eye, like eyes. So mata versus maka, right? Of the number 5, lima versus elima. And they noticed that, there is that, I think Armstrong called it a meeting of long lost brothers, that kinship was formed. And 𝗏𝗃𝗧 himself, he noticed the similarity, and he wrote back home to say that he could confirm for himself that the Austronesian region was an unmistakable space of shared culture and kinship. And when we think about his desire to build a coalition, to build this confederacy, it leads us into this next key moment of the meeting, which is the gifting of a royal order. Very simply, royal orders at that point in time in the 19th century were really important as a formality, right? It was how representatives from two places could communicate that they had formed a relationship, especially if there wasn't one before. Abu Bakr was awarded the Order of the Cross of 𝗏𝗃𝗧, which was the second most highly ranked order in the kingdom at that time. And what is essential about this is that Abu Bakr had no order to reciprocate with. It was a gift. And this is, again, highly unusual. 𝗏𝗃𝗧 made this voluntary gift, and the time is up. Oh, 2 minutes, great. 𝗏𝗃𝗧 made this voluntary gift to show, right, that this informal one-night visit became an official part of his tour, where diplomatic activity was conducted and royal orders presented. This was only repeated ever once after, in Samoa, because 𝗏𝗃𝗧 wanted to do the same thing, to join Hawaii and Samoa in confederacy. And very quickly, I think just to wrap this part up, there might be a few reasons, right? Could it be because that 𝗏𝗃𝗧 might have recognized that there was also pressure Abu Bakr was under to become a British protectorate? But did he want to diffuse that pressure by including Johor more in international diplomacy and emphasizing its sovereignty? Could it be they just really had a great time eating otak-otak and wanted to, declare his friendship towards someone that he found he was distant cousins with? And regardless of that, I think it is imperative, though, he did think it was imperative to formalize that relationship after all he had seen and he had experienced during this visit to Johor. I'll end with this slide, but this is what 𝗏𝗃𝗧 said when he was departing Johor, right? His parting words to the Maharaja was this. He had now discovered that his own people were Asiatics, and he hoped that Asiatic nations would become powerful and stand by one another. So 𝗏𝗃𝗧 may have had begun his world tour with the intention to reach out to more influential, let's say, Asian states like in China, like Japan. However, what we can see here is he did find clear markers of physical, cultural similarities with Abu Bakr, with Johor, which seemingly made him more eager to include Johor as well in these plans for formal alliance. he did build that infrastructure post-visit, where he wrote letters to 𝗵𝗶𝗃𝗏, and he sent an envoy there as well to Johor. And if not for, I think, the disruption in terms of 𝗏𝗏𝗏's death in 1891, as well as the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom in 1893, what I think would have happened, right? And it's maybe another world is possible then, where 𝗏𝗏𝗏 was already hinting at this early form of Asia-Pacific cooperation and partnership, right? In a world that was still very much imperial at the time. And, you know, a confederacy of that kind of reach he had envisioned could very well have marked this region as a growing united power, making it a little bit more challenging for nations to essentially dominate as they did. But I think, just to wrap us all up, 𝗏𝗏𝗏's visit to Johor, I think, really implored me to question another relationship which I thought of less frequently, right? What was Johor's relationship with the Pacific as one of the islands or one of the places within the Pacific Ocean? It inspired me to think of other crucial moments in Pacific history that Johor might have played a part in. And I think growing up or studying, right, I almost saw the Pacific, or knew about the Pacific, as just the islands which form what we know as Polynesia, Melanesia, and Micronesia, but I never really asked whether there was more to that. So this, I think, capstone really made me think a little bit more about connections and how they don't just abruptly stop with boundaries, and how there could be so many more potential stories of maybe fascinating oceanic encounters, which I'm unaware of because it's obscured by the arbitrary boundaries and limits that exist. And really thinking, I think, finally about how places like maybe Singapore, like Johor, have always been member to almost this idea of a maritime highway, right? Which they are connected by the endless number of islands dotting the vast expanse of waterways, rivers, and I think finally the Pacific Ocean. So thank you, I think.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for that, Celeste. And I mean, it speaks, I think, to the heart of, in some ways, to the inspiration and imagination that Barbara had in her article, Oceans Unbounded, which worked out some of these connections. And I think, like many of us who did study in Hawaii, you can't leave that place without thinking about the parallels and interactions between Pacific world history and Malay world history. Thank you again, Celeste. We're now going to go to Dr. Effendi, who is a senior lecturer. The titles, I'm always funky with the titles. Anyways, he teaches in the Department of Southeast Asian Studies here at the National University of Singapore. Over to you, Effendi.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Anthony, for organizing this and inviting me to deliver this, essentially a tribute to the Andayas. And if I may say this straight away about the role that Andayas played to my intellectual development, there is no words for it. There are no words for it. Really, it's hutang budi dengan hutang nyawa. For those here who understand Malay, it is a debt of favor and a debt of life to both Andayas, who basically guided me to do probably one of the hardest research topics that I have anyone's encountered in South Asian studies, which is the 𝗏. And I will explain a little bit why this turn I made away from the 𝗏 now on the Bugis, and it's also due to their works as well. So let me begin with this. Okay, initially the title was The Secrets of 𝗏 Warriors, but again, the 𝗏 are extinct. Their warriors are totally decimated, so I can't do a history of that. So I decided on the next best thing, Secrets of Bugis Warriors. Intellectual debt, it is massive. This kind of research that I need to do to prepare myself for this topic is certainly immense. It is tough. But with their guidance, really, and especially with their convincing me of doing this type of works, these are the 𝗏 manuscripts, a genre which I term as dalukan, and this is where it gets really tough to understand this code. Essentially, what coded language is. It is really difficult because not only you have to understand what is said, You got to understand the context. Remember what both Andaya said to us, there is no text but context. So in order to understand this, you need to understand the accompanying ritual, the accompanying performances of the text, so on and so forth. So a total understanding of the text, which Timothy really mentioned just now as respecting the source. And this is something which is a very powerful lesson to me, even till today. Respect your source and things will follow. So in my research about the charm initially, the question that I asked myself for a very long time is that why are the charm not mentioned in Barbara and Leonard work in the history of Malaysia? And this is the book that I grew up with, secondary and especially during my A levels. I read this every day. Why in my teenage years? Because I really wanted to understand about the history of Malaysia. And this is what I grew up with. And then I found out that there are real people. They existed. And they existed in Hawaii. And therefore, one day I told myself, I will go there and study with them. So this is what happened in the course of the research. Early on, I developed interest in Champa, and I wanted to do something on the Malay world. Something is quite ambiguous. And then it occurred to me that I must do field work. You know, this is very, very important because field work in Vietnam, southern Vietnam, was a life-changing moment because that was when I decided to do a PhD after that, after interacting with the Cham communities, going to the temples such as Poklong Garai, so on and so forth. And the most interesting thing that happened to me was that there was a complete absence of trade. There were no ports. There were nothing. They were poor. They only had temples and memory. So this is something which also propels me to do PhD with the Andayas. Now, how I got to study with the Andayas is very, very interesting as well. Was in 2005, Professor Stephen O'Hara came to Singapore, and it was in NUS for which he heard about me, the only Malay guy who can speak Vietnamese in NUS, and he immediately decided to meet me. And we had that little coffee meeting outside LT11. He asked me questions in Vietnamese. I responded in Vietnamese. He was very impressed. And he asked me straight off, Steve is very direct. Do you want to do a PhD with the Andayas? So I said, yes. Do you have money to give me? Yes, we do. Okay. Scholarships, I mean. So immediately it was a sign-up course to study with the Andayas. And it was a life-changing moment for me. So straight away, I decided to go to do my PhD 2007 onwards to study with the Andayas. And what I did there was very, very important in the course of my research because I encountered this book, Leaves of the Same Tree, mentioned a bit about the charm, but to me, not enough can be complemented with, this research on the charm manuscripts. Now, this is the important moment. The more I read this stuff, this is essentially a record of kings, a genealogy of Cham rulers, about what they did, about what are their powers are like, and more importantly, what they didn't do. What they didn't do were commercial activities. What they didn't do was fight the Vietnamese. What they didn't do was to engage the Malay world as much as they could. So this is these are, to me, when I was gradually gaining understanding of this particular genre, a very curious question. And it began to dawn on me, and the Andayas guided me to understanding of this and of this perspective, is that who are actually writing these things in the first place? Secondly, why are they writing it in such a way? And third most important factor is that why are certain things left out of this particular source? And this is where we have this choir or angels singing that, and it began to dawn on me that they were written by the religious elites of the Cham at a point of time for which the Cham rulers were completely decimated, completely powerless. And these religious and cultural elites decided to tell the story of the Cham rulers when the Cham kingdom was completely destroyed. So this is something of a very important perspective to these manuscripts as to why so many things are not mentioned. So that was the basis of my PhD dissertation. I argued that, okay, Maspero wrote that 1471, Champa ended. True. Po Dharma came into the scene in the 70s and said that Kaluranga was the last Cham kingdom around. True. And then my perspective, why the 𝗏 survived even till today was through the efforts of the 𝗏 religious elites who remembered the kings in their own way. However, there is a price to pay. Meaning that once you have a society completely dominated by religious elites, you tend to have a society which are quite shy of trade, quite willing to cut off maritime connections. And this was where I began to get a new understanding of why the 𝗏 are so poor, even till today, was that they are cut off from maritime connections. That was where I left my research with the 𝗏, because trying to find answers to this particular question became really hard, because the other types of 𝗏 manuscripts which are still around in the villages of the 𝗏 are basically religious and cultural texts, which are very, very difficult to read. So I decided to take a break and decided to focus on what do the 𝗏 do outside of Champa. And this is where I got a lot of strange clues and insights. The first clue was left by Dr. Peter Boschberg, who wrote this book on Martleaf sources. And the European observations of the 𝗏 were immediately standing out to me. They were, the 𝗏 outside of Champa, southern Vietnam, were actively cultivating alliances. They were establishing commercial and military forces, which are, frankly, blowing my mind even till today. And what I learned about in Andayas as well, that there were 𝗏 military units called the Krum Asal 𝗏. So all this information about the 𝗏 outside of Champa gives me one essential clue, big one, that, hey, it could be that the 𝗏 are retaining their military, economic, political prowess as a diasporic entity. And then it comes, then I discovered something really odd in all this, that Johor was actually an important site for Bugis 𝗏 interactions. And this was something which is very important. This particular work here by Barbara, this article which she wrote for the Asia Pacific Journal, this particular point on page 540, the Trans-Ocean Standpoint. Basically what she says is that the seas connect. Without maritime connections, a community will not be able to develop further. And this is something which I learned really well about the 𝗏. They were cut off from the sea. They cannot engage their maritime operations, and they are put off for it. And this is where we get into interesting relationship with the Bugis 𝗏 and Johor connections here. This particular work of Dato' Haji Abdul Syukur Ismail, Sejarah Ringkas Muar, A Brief History of Muar. Now, what he has here, based on largely interviews with families, very old families in Muar, Johor, was this particular title here, which I found really odd. He recorded the existence in Muar of a very powerful noble called Daing Seriok, Anak Raja Cempar Bugis Bukit Mo. Sounds a mouthful, but I have never found this title ever before in all my attempts to understand the 𝗏 diasporic community in Southeast Asia. And then I read further this work that there is an alternative story to the Malay annals. In the 𝗏𝗶𝗏 version of the story of Raja Champa, the story of the 𝗏 king, there are two 𝗏 princes who escaped Champa, don't know the date, but could be 15th century. That two princes escaped, one of them escaped to Malacca. He's called Shah Indra Burman, established a family relationship with the rulers of Malacca, and another ruler named Pau Shah Ling. He went to Aceh, and this is the Malay annals version. However, according to the family histories of this version here, this ruler went to Muar. All right, Pau Shah Ling make a U-turn, left turn to Johor, where he interacted with Bugis communities in Muar. So that was when I decided to take this interesting turn to find out why were the 𝗏 interested in the Bugis at all. And lo and behold, I had to read, therefore, the heritage of Warung Pelaka, and of course, the nature of war and peace from Bugis Makassar people, of which, you know, if my interest really peaked with these two works. First of all, heritage of Warung Pelaka. Through the Dutch sources which Leonard interrogated, I really see and understand why the 𝗏 liked the Bugis very much. They were fearless. They were all very well organized militarily, and more importantly, in the 17th century, there are a lot of them in the Malay world. because of the Makassari's migration to this part of the world. We see a lot of them trying to get into royal families through intermarriage, and more importantly, deploy their forces to dominate trade and dominate politics. And how they fought is very important because it is described by this work here, Nature and War and Peace. And without this work, it's very difficult for me to really understand how and why the 𝗏𝗏, like the Bugis. It is obvious to me that to the 𝗏𝗏 diaspora, the Bugis offered them a new inroad into maritime connections, political and military connections, but only if you intermarry with important Bugis individuals. Hence this title here. This synthesis of two understandings of two different peoples around the world, in southern Vietnam and the Bugis world, 𝗏𝗏𝗃𝗏 anak Raja Cempa, which basically means, yeah, the son of a royal 𝗏𝗏 person, but with Bugis blood. So it makes perfect sense to me. And then there's another turn. I actually interacted with a lot of Bugis persons in Singapore. Why? Because of this interesting angle that Leonard opened the door to, how they fought. So I asked myself this question after reading this work: are there any martial art groups in Singapore that has these elements that Leonard was describing, how they fought? Yes, there are. So this is where the research into Silat began, especially the descendants of Bugis in Singapore that still retain martial arts knowledge and, of course, historical knowledge about their families. And lo and behold, I opened up a very old cabinet full of amazing letters, literally. I wish I find that, but that's word which I described to really understand, to describe what I found so far. And there is a lot of stuff that we can work with. And what I found so far is that in Singapore, there are two major Bugis groups, one from Makassar and one from Bonaire. And these martial migrants came to Singapore in the 19th and 20th century and founded Singapore's earliest Silat schools. First founder was Daeng Omar. We don't know who he is. Could be from Makassar. We don't know. All records are expunged. And this guy established the first Siligi schools in Singapore, which is very powerful today, and they are now branched out because of infighting, as usual lah. Melayu will be good schools like that. Always fight, so they fragment. Never-ending story of fragmentation in the Malay world. So this is very understandable. That's the Makassar school. However, I also discovered a Bonaire school of martial arts in Singapore, founded by La Tata Ambrala or Daeng Manasap. And this is the guy here who continued his grandfather's martial traditions. And I was featured in the Straits Times for my project on restoring and recovering martial arts knowledge in Singapore, funded by the National Heritage Board. Thank you very much. So this is something very important to me because, to my shock and surprise, and of course, joy, we have a lot of families in Singapore that still preserve this very ancient knowledge. And again, as the Andayas taught us, you got contacts, but no text. What do? You find one. So this launched my foray into the Makassar and Bonaire areas. I met the descendants of Arungs in Bonaire. We talked about their lineage, and he showed me amazing sources, especially the genealogies that he still keeps. And this is something which I would like to show you guys. Can I show the clip first? Just 1 minute clip, right? The essence of martial powers still being preserved by groups, even in Singapore. The old song is the old song, the oath of war, for loyalty to the religious ruler. Right, now this is important, just a little bit. Let me go back to the slide again. Now, this Osong is the primary feature in Bugis warfare. And this is something which I discovered as well about the warfare in the Pahang Civil War. This was demonstrated and used during by the forces of Temenggung Abu Bakar, who has Bugis forces in his retinue. And they did this in front of Bernahada Muda Wan Koris, and the morale of his troops completely collapsed because of this display. So this also leads to a new inroad that I'm researching right now. What happened to these Bugis martial groups in Singapore, Johor, and Riau? And what happened to the Silawatang, Blaka Juara, and Ponggawai of the Bugis descended rulers of the Malay world? And this is where Barbara's work is so important. The 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏, she has English version of it, so crucial, because in this source, we see a lot of descriptions about all those titles, individuals who have those titles in the warfare of Bugis descended rulers in Riau and Johor. And lastly, I must say this, that yes, the legacies of the Bugis in Singapore are still ongoing. I even wrote this book about the Silat group called Gayung Pasak, who have a very localized Bugis martial arts system, but they are quite very famous in Singapore as well as in Malaysia. So this is something which is an ongoing legacy. And I would like to stop with this, all right? There are also women who have prowess in Kajang Bulukumba, and they are also displaying their kekebalan, invulnerability, increased performance as well. And if you want to understand this, you need to read this, The Flaming Wolf. And I would like to say this to both Barbara and Leonard. Thank you so much for guiding me, and thank you for your patience in my intellectual journey. I'm sure that it is something which we all cherish, and I would like to say thank you and hormat. Right? Thank you so much.
That was wonderful, Effendi. Thank you so much. And I think, Effendi, you bring out a side not just of the history, but how the field of history is also so intertwined with Southeast Asian studies too. So we're going to go to our last speaker today, who is Professor Lance Nolde from CSU Channel Islands. Over to you, Lance.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for having us here. Thank you, Anthony, for organizing the event. Thank you, Leonard and Barbara, for attending during your family event at home. I just want to give a brief snippet of my research today, kind of working on indigenous political orders among nomadic and semi-nomadic sea peoples, and also for the Cambridge History Project, working on some of the forest communities of Southeast Asia, like the Orang Asli.
Wait, speak into the mic.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Not used to the microphone. But I also want to really kind of emphasize how my work has been influenced and shaped by the mentorship of Barbara and Leonard. So I had the privilege of working with and learning from Leonard and Barbara. It's been an incredible blessing. They've kind of been a powering set of figures in my life, my academic life, since I entered University of Hawaii Manoa as a master's student, all the way to the day I defended my PhD dissertation, and in all the years since that time as well. They've offered guidance and support at every single step of my academic career, good, bad, strange, and all in between. And so for this, I'm incredibly grateful. Like each of the speakers have kind of emphasized today, studying with the Andayas at the University of Hawaii was formative for me and everyone in my cohort that I know, several of which are here in this dated picture that was taken in Leonard and Barbara's beautiful backyard on a night when I think...
Change your slide.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Right
Wrong one.
Wow. Yes, that was dated.
Where is it? There we go. There it is. All right. Sorry about that. Okay. So now we're in the Andaya's backyard. And this was a core group of people several of which are here today, and very special people in my lives. And I think every single person in that photo would say that the Andayas were monumental in shaping who they are as academics and probably as teachers and scholars in every other sense of the word. I entered the University of Hawaii at Manoa with, like Tim, a sense of I was going to study West Papua and the modern political issues related to West Papua from a historical perspective. But within weeks of being in the master's program under Leonard, I quickly was interested in the early modern period, still Eastern Indonesia, but pretty far from Papua and the modern political struggles. I wasn't forced or coerced. I was, I would say, inspired and influenced through lectures and everything I was reading. They really basically opened up a world of possibilities that I didn't know existed. And they guided me through each step of that, like figuring out where I wanted to go and what I wanted to do. And they gave me a lot of grace and leeway in doing so. To list all the different ways in which they have inspired me or shaped my work or influenced the trajectory of my career would be impossible, especially given we're probably at like 12 minutes now. So for the sake of brevity, I'll focus on a couple things. Early on, and several of the speakers today kind of touched on this as well. Very early on in our studies, I remember in seminars with Leonard being admonished to not pick flowers from other people's gardens, meaning we needed to do original research. We needed to learn to read the primary sources in whatever languages were required to answer the questions that we had. And we couldn't lean too heavily on the work of scholars who came before us, even their own work, right? The idea was, and I guess this is something that 𝗏𝗏𝗽𝗏 had said to both of the Andayas at their time at Cornell, right? Learn the local languages, learn how to do research in these languages, work with them alongside the European sources. And that's how you might begin to sort of piece together the early modern period. The other thing that was very important and influential in terms of the Andayas' teaching and their writing was to seek out regional connections, to look for commonalities, to identify networks, patterns, and unities that sort of transcended conventional boundaries of, island or kingdom or modern territorial borders at the time. Whether you were an Indonesianist or a Thai specialist or working on Burma, you needed to be a Southeast Asianist at the end of the day. And that had sort of massively influenced the way I approached my very local focused kind of work. And this is, they didn't just teach this, they modeled it in their own research, obviously. I mean, the time period that I'm referring to, Barbara had just published Flaming Womb. And if you're not familiar with this is a massively sweeping regional study. And Leonard soon after published Leaves of the Same Tree, which again was a very influential and wide reaching kind of work on the Malay world. In subsequent years, both of them, both the Andayas also pushed us to begin looking at different sort of historical spaces, namely the sea, and how oceans connected rather than divided, and how the seas were these sort of important spaces of connectivity and rich sites for historical inquiry. I should have switched this one further, but I pilfered these from a more recent talk of the Andayas here just to give you some photos for it. So all of these elements sort of combined in my work, but one of the more influential elements of the Andayas' work that kind of pushed me on the path that I've been on for the last several years was to highlight the importance of sort of lesser known and often politically marginalized communities within Southeast Asia. This has inspired my work on mobile populations of the seas and the forests, and really trying to work to highlight their dynamic role in the creation of early modern Southeast Asia. Several scholars, along with the Andayas, really kind of mapped out that early modern period. They mapped out the ways in which overland and sea routes connected even the most remote shores of island Southeast Asia to the sort of the larger prosperous port cities of the archipelago and the mainland, and how these in turn were linked to major centers of the Indian Ocean and China and global trade. Both Leonard and Barbara highlighted how local demand for foreign luxury goods combined with international appetites for rare Southeast Asian forest and sea products, and how this sort of trade developed out of those appetites was central to the complex of changes that we associate with the early modern period. And really, the highlight or the central focus of most studies were these lowland and coastal states. But it was the Andayas and others who helped bring to light a number of these sort of semi-nomadic and nomadic communities of the forest and the seas, who were actually indispensable to these systems of regional and international trade. These groups held incomparable knowledge of the flora and the fauna of the region, and they were vital to the collection and distribution of the products that were in high demand to these internationally linked markets. The Andayas and Leonard in particular highlighted how many of these mobile communities came to hold privileged positions within a system of complementary economies. And most of them formed strong alliances with lowland and coastal polities, mostly through marriages and alliances, military and otherwise. But in each and every case, the success of these trading states, like Malacca, like Makassar, they depended greatly on the goods and the skills of the forest and sea peoples. So the core of my research has focused on one of these mobile populations, the 𝗤𝗏𝗏𝗏. If you're not familiar with them, the 𝗤𝗏𝗏𝗏 are a part of the larger 𝗤𝗏𝗏 ethno-linguistic group that inhabit the seas and littoral of eastern Indonesia, and what the Andayas have referred to more recently as the northern archipelago, encompassing the Philippines and the northeastern coasts of Borneo. The 𝗤𝗏𝗏𝗏 are the largest and most widely dispersed of all the principal groups of sea peoples, including the Orang Laut. And they are just one subgroup of this larger 𝗤𝗏𝗏 ethno-linguistic group, excuse me. They roughly amount to about 1.5 million speakers spread throughout the coasts of eastern Malaysia, southern Philippines, and eastern Indonesia. They're often referred to as Bajau, or in the Indonesian world, Bajo, and in the Western literature often as sea nomads or sea gypsies. Wherever you find them, the 𝗤𝗏𝗏𝗏 are typically found living on houseboats or larger estuarine or littoral communities, and they practice a sort of complex, highly specialized adaptation to the marine environment. My research lately has focused mostly on unique political orders that have developed within these communities. Whereas the historiography sees these groups as largely being acephalous or leaderless, egalitarian, and largely sort of fragmented rather than unified. Within the 𝗤𝗏𝗏𝗏 populations, the historical records show that there are at least 2 dominant political orders that were linked to the large kingdoms in South Sulawesi, namely Makassar and Bone. There's the first group, which is organized under a leader that was with the title of the Papu, and they were allied with Goa and Taluk since the beginning of the 14th century and perhaps even earlier. And then the other, which I'll focus on today, which coalesce under the figures who held the title Lolo Bajo, and they were allied with the Kingdom of Bone, beginning at the conclusion of the Makassar War that ended in 1669, and roughly until about the Third Dutch-Bone War, which concluded in 1906. So a pretty long and strong alliance. For the latter, the Lolo Bajo communities, this is basically a loosely confederated network of settlements and more nomadic bands that would periodically coalesce under the leadership of these figures who held the title of Lolo Bajo. Their groups are spread within a pretty wide stretch of southern and eastern Sulawesi, as well as related islands in Nusa Tenggara. The map here, you can see, if you're not familiar with Sulawesi, all of those green dots are Bajo villages mapped out by Nagatsu Kazufumi in Japan. And on this map, you'll see there's these squares that roughly coincide with map 11, 12, 13, and parts of map 16. These are many of the communities to which I'm referring. So within this wide stretch of Eastern Sulawesi and beyond, there are village leaders who typically held the title of Punggawa, or Datu in some cases. And they typically held nominal authority over one or more villages in a kind of a specific area. In these communities, these people were sort of primus inter pares. They were elected from their peers. They function as mediators, as patrons, and as leaders in village disputes and other matters. But some of these individuals exercised a degree of authority over the village heads and even over all other Punggawa in a pretty wide area. Each of these domains or each of these green dots, and there are many, many others that Nagatsu did not map on this for this particular article that he was working on. And this isn't even counting the sort of nomadic bands that are moving through this area and live in boat-based communities. But these individual domains, typically we see them as existing as a single node within webs that are connected, these distant communities connected through kinship, shared histories, as well as trade and politics. For the most part, the connection of a particular village or a nomadic band to a wider network of communities was mostly episodic. Often it was seasonal, and the more sedentary villages to which they were linked were primarily visited simply for family or fellowship, information, resources, and trade, rather than any overarching political structure or system of power. For the most part, these communities within this broader confederation remained largely autonomous, and their day-to-day orientation was toward the political and economic intricacies of their particular locale rather than any larger unity. And that's typically the way we have understood the Sama Bajo polities up until this point. But in the history of these mobile suit communities, there is very strong evidence from the Bugis records, the Makassarese records, as well as in the Dutch material and also local Sama Bajo manuscripts and oral traditions, that there is the existence of confederations of multiple settlements united under a paramount leader. In the case that I'm referring to today, the Ḽoḽo Bajo. So at the center of this network of linked communities was the figure, sometimes male, sometimes female, who held the title of Ḽoḽo Bajo. They typically resided in the port site community of Bajoy in the Gulf of Bone, which refers to, the Bajo presence there. And there too resided a Punggawa and a Galarang, who both of which were the sort of the right-hand men and women of the Ḽoḽo Bajo. These figures served as intermediaries between the Ḽoḽo Bajo as the paramount leader of this confederation, as well as the various dispersed communities that were under his or her control wherever they may be. The Ḽoḽo Bajo, as well as the various Punggawa or Galarang, were traditionally chosen based on a combination of valued qualities, bravery, economic prowess, prowess in the realm of fishing, sailing, those things, as well as descent from noble lineage. The Ḽoḽo Bajo was always selected from among his or her peers at special gatherings of members of related settlements, some of which would sail several hundreds of miles to attend these gatherings. In one case of the leader, the Ḽoḽo Toapa was his name, his investiture on the island of Callao, which is between Sulawesi and Flores there. This was attended by leaders from villages as far away as Togian, up in the northeast of Sulawesi in the Tomini Bay, and as far away as Maluku as well. This was a sort of kinetic polity, and the fact that it fluctuated between confederated communities under centralized leadership and then returning back to largely unstratified settlements that functioned autonomously. We see this sort of patterned oscillation between fragmentation and confederation within the same polity, uniting when and as needed, or operating as a whole for a moment and then dispersing again across wide seascapes where they functioned as a smaller unit once again. Yet when political or cultural or economic needs demanded, this wider unity was enacted, and you sort of see this rhizomatic network of autonomous communities called upon to support the paramount leader as well as the allied kingdom of Bone. Political unity and centralized leadership appeared to coalesce mostly in times of need, such as interaction with outside states and leaders, interaction with the Dutch colonial state at different points, moments of crises such as war, times of succession, as well as in the collection of tribute in the name of the Lolobajo as part of the alliance with the Kingdom of Bone. All right, so I'm running out of time here, but basically what I wanted to kind of highlight is how, although we see in the historical record that these communities were important, and the scholarship has suggested that these communities were important in the sort of the establishment of Makassar and the Kingdom of Bone, what we don't look at so much is how these communities formed individual polities, unique political orders amongst themselves, and how these mobile political orders functioned and operated on the day-to-day basis. To wrap it up, I want to, again, reiterate what Bryce had said before, right? It's very hard to put into words what the Andayas have done for us personally, academically, and on our careers. Like Bryce said, my academic career is entirely owed to the Andayas. Everything that I have achieved thus far has been on their backs in many different ways, and I'm forever grateful for that. And hopefully we can continue to produce scholarship that they might at least slightly be proud of.
Well put, Lance, well put. And I think I can say that I share that same sentiment. I'm gonna, before we launch into a very quick Q&A, because we have some tea and quay following this. Before we launch into that, though, I do want to ask if it's okay if Barbara and Leonard would like to say a few words, or just maybe say hi or aloha or what have you. Over to you two.
Barbara, you go first.
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you so much for organizing this occasion. It's been, I have to say that being with students has been one of the great joys of my life that I never really anticipated. And I retire with many misgivings, I have to say. I've been giving an extra lease of 12 months because I still have some students pending. So, but what is marvelous, I think, if I think back to when I first started graduate school in 1966, is the possibility of maintaining international connections. I mean, who could have envisaged in 1966 that Leonard and I would one day sit here talking to people in several different countries and seeing their faces and hearing their work. The advances in technology are just amazing and so rewarding and so evident on this occasion. And I thank all of you for coming. I thank you for all that you've taught us and for the great joy that we've experienced in working with you, whatever your research was. So thank you.
So what I'd like to say is how proud I am of all of you. When you think back to all the things you've done, it's such a joy to know that you've absorbed what we taught you, but you've moved on and you've gone even far beyond what I have expected. And, you know, we're very, very proud of what you've accomplished. And what I love is that picture that, was it Lance who showed us, where everybody was in the backyard? You know, here you are so young, you know, everything just starting out. And then now, you're not as old as we are, but you're getting to the point, right, where you're getting your own students, you're doing your own thing. But it's lovely to see the shift from the youngsters with the future ahead of you, and then to the present where you've been accomplishing so much, all of you. I'm so proud. I mean, it makes me teary as well. So thank you very much, all of you, for putting this on. It really does mean a lot to Barbara and me. Thank you. Thank you, Anthony, for organizing it. This has been wonderful.
Well, thank you both. Thank you both for, let's give them a hand.